Can I please change my seat? The words cut through the low drone of the aircraft, quiet but trembling with restrained frustration. The black passenger sat upright, eyes steady on the flight attendant who had just leaned into their row. Around them, a few heads turned, curious, sensing tension brewing. The attendant's practiced smile didn't reach their eyes. "Is there a problem, sir?" Their tone was crisp, clipped, carrying the kind of politeness that feels sharp rather than kind. The passenger hesitated, then glanced sideways. Their seatmate shifted in their chair with exaggerated annoyance, arms folded tightly, lips pressed thin. The hostility was unspoken but heavy, hanging in the air like static before a storm. "Yes," the passenger said at last, voice calm but firm. "I think it would be better if I sat somewhere else." A pause. A flash of calculation in the attendant's eyes, then a stiff nod. "I'll see what we can do." The attendant disappeared down the aisle, leaving the passenger with a swirl of emotions, relief, hope, unease. Around them, whispers buzzed, quickly silenced when eyes met. Nobody wanted to be involved, but everyone was watching. Minutes ticked by, each one longer than the last. Finally, the attendant returned, clipboard in hand. Their voice was louder now, carrying just enough edge to draw attention from the rows around. "Sir, please gather your belongings. We've reassigned you." The passenger stood, clutching their bag, heart pounding. For a moment, they imagined being led to a better seat, away from hostility. But as they followed, reality unfolded. Row after row passed, the space growing tighter, the comfort thinner, until the attendant stopped. "Here you are," they said, gesturing to a narrow economy seat. The passenger froze. "This is economy." "That's correct," the attendant replied smoothly. "Please, sit down." A few passengers. Those nearby raised their brows, some exchanging glances, but no one spoke. No one challenged the decision. Silence filled the cabin, heavy with complicity. Slowly, the passenger lowered themselves into the cramped seat, knees pressing against the seat back ahead. They stared straight ahead, pulse racing with humiliation. The downgrade wasn't about logistics. It was about power, about pushing someone down because they dared to ask for fairness. The engines thundered outside, indifferent to the small cruelty unfolding inside. But within the passenger's chest, something stirred. A quiet storm. This was more than just a seat. It was a wound. A humiliation burned into memory. And though the flight continued like nothing had happened, the story had already begun, one that would not end in the sky, but in the halls of justice. The moment the passenger sat down in economy, the air inside the cabin shifted. It wasn't loud, not explosive, but it was there, a ripple of unease that passed from row to row. A woman 2 seats over leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Why would they move him back here?" The husband shook his head, eyes fixed forward. "Don't get involved," he muttered quickly, his voice tight. The hush spread like wildfire. A teenager across the aisle tugged at his earbuds, glancing curiously before sinking back into his seat. A businessman frowned, tapping his pen nervously against his notebook. But he said nothing. People noticed. People cared. But fear of confrontation, fear of trouble, kept every voice buried. The flight attendant, meanwhile, walked the aisles with calculated composure. Clipboard in hand, posture stiff, they acted as though nothing unusual had occurred. To them, the decision was final. To everyone else, it was unsettling. The passenger, now squeezed between strangers in the cramped row, could feel the stares. Not direct, not obvious, just fleeting glances that burned like quiet judgment. Their chest tightened, a mix of anger and humiliation twisting together. They clenched their jaw, whispering only to themselves, "All I asked for was respect." But respect was exactly what had been stripped away. The silence of the cabin spoke louder than any words. Every cough, every shuffle of papers, every click of a seatbelt seemed magnified. Behind that silence lived a truth. People saw injustice, but nobody dared to challenge it. A young mother across the aisle adjusted her child's blanket, her eyes lingering just a second too long on the passenger before quickly darting away. She wanted to say something. She wanted to acknowledge it, but the weight of what if kept her still. In that stillness, the passenger sat upright, shoulders tense, heart pounding. A fire was beginning to build, not wild and uncontrolled, but slow, smouldering. The kind of fire that doesn't fade but waits for its chance to burn bright. The flight dragged on, yet the mood never lifted. Conversations were hushed, laughter subdued, the normal rhythm of travel broken by an unspoken awareness. Something wrong had happened here, and everyone knew it. The flight attendant passed again, eyes briefly meeting the passengers. There was no apology, no hint of doubt, only a thin veneer of authority. For a fleeting moment, the passenger wondered if they were the only one who truly felt the sting. But the whispers told another story. People knew. They simply chose silence over courage. The engines roared on outside, but inside, tension lingered. The injustice wouldn't vanish when the wheels hit the ground. No. This wound was deeper than a seat assignment. It was personal, unforgettable, and soon it would demand to be heard. Because what began as whispers in the cabin was only the prelude. The real storm was waiting. After landing, the wheels screeched against the runway, jolting the cabin with a rough landing. To most passengers, it was just another flight finally over. But for one man, the moment the seatbelt light dimmed, the real turbulence began. He rose slowly, collecting his bag, his movements sharp with contained anger. Each step down the aisle replayed the humiliation in his mind, the whispers, the stares, the sting of being cast aside. Do I report this? Or do I just walk away? The question hammered inside him. Speaking up could bring justice, but it could also bring more pain. As he stepped into the terminal, the air felt heavy, colder somehow. His phone buzzed. A text from a friend. "How was your flight?" He stared at the screen, fingers trembling, then typed back a single word. Unbelievable. Meanwhile, back at the gate, the flight attendant was already at work. Clipboard open, pen scratching across paper, they documented the incident, not as it happened, but as they chose to frame it. Passenger was disruptive, they muttered under their breath, jotting down lines. Refused to cooperate, created tension among others. Their version painted them as the calm professional who had dealt with a difficult traveller. To anyone reading later, it would seem like the attendant had been the one under attack. Two stories were now alive. One, rooted in truth, a man quietly humiliated for daring to ask for respect. The other, carefully crafted, an attendant claiming they had contained a brewing problem in the skies. The passenger stood outside, luggage at his side, staring at the bustle of arrivals. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand that someone listen, but the exhaustion was crushing. He whispered to himself, "If I fight this, will anyone believe me?" His reflection in the terminal glass looked back at him, shoulders slumped yet eyes burning. The fire that had started on the plane hadn't gone out. It was spreading. Back in the staff office, the attendant sealed the report in a file, satisfied. To them, the story was closed, tied neatly with their words. But what they didn't know was that their account wouldn't stay buried in airline records. One day, it would surface, dragging both of them into a confrontation far greater than either imagined. As the passenger walked toward the exit doors, he clenched his jaw. He didn't know when or how, but deep down he felt it. This wasn't over. And outside, As taxis honked and people hurried through the terminal, the stage was quietly being set for a battle that would no longer be confined to whispers or paperwork, but carried into the unforgiving light of a courtroom. The envelope arrived on an ordinary afternoon, slipped through the door with the day's usual mail. At first it looked like nothing, a standard letter, official yet unassuming. But as the passenger tore it open and unfolded the document inside, his stomach sank. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a routine notice. It was a summons. The words leapt from the page like a cruel trick. A formal complaint has been filed. The flight attendant's name was listed at the top, followed by allegations of misconduct and intimidation aboard the aircraft. For a moment the room spun. Misconduct? Intimidation? He whispered, disbelief cracking his voice. His hands trembled as he read further. The attendant's account painted him not as the victim of humiliation, but as the aggressor. Hostile, disruptive, even threatening. He dropped the paper onto the table and paced the room, his thoughts a storm. This can't be real. How can they twist the truth like this? His memory replayed the flight in sharp detail. The cold stares, the whispers, the sting of being pushed into economy. And now, this? Anger surged, but beneath it was something stronger. Fear. He had lived long enough to know how dangerous false narratives could be, especially when the truth came from a black man standing alone against an authority figure in uniform. He sat down, clutching his head in his hands. If I don't fight this, I'll be branded forever. But if I do fight, who will believe me? Across town, the flight attendant signed their own copy of the complaint, expression unreadable. To colleagues, they spoke confidently, insisting they had handled a difficult passenger with professionalism. He created a scene, they said coolly. I felt unsafe. Each word layered onto the lie, building a wall of defense around their version of the story. Meanwhile, the passenger reached for his phone. He called a close friend, voice unsteady. They've filed a case against me. The line went silent before the reply came, hushed and heavy. You can't let this stand. You have to defend yourself. And in that moment, clarity struck. He realized the humiliation on the plane had been only the beginning. This legal battle, was where his dignity truly hung in the balance. The days that followed were restless. He sought out legal advice, gathering every shred of strength he had. His lawyer, flipping through the complaint, frowned deeply. Their version is strong, but it's built on fiction. The question is, can we prove it? Every meeting, every phone call, every night spent staring at the ceiling sharpened his resolve. The fear didn't vanish, but it hardened into determination. He would not let his story be erased. Because what began as a quiet request for a seat change had spiraled into something larger, a fight not just for himself, but for truth itself. And as the court date loomed, one thing became clear. This battle was no longer about an uncomfortable flight. It was about justice. The summons lay on the table, its official seal staring back at him like a challenge. He picked it up, folded it carefully, and slid it into his briefcase. The fire in his chest burned brighter now. This was no longer a choice. It was a call to stand. And soon, in the solemn silence of a courtroom, both stories, the truth and the lie, would finally collide. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. Every step echoed on the marble floor. Every breath seemed louder than it should. This wasn't just another building. It was an arena where truth and lies would soon collide. The passenger stood at the entrance, briefcase in hand, heart hammering like a drumbeat. He paused, staring at the double doors ahead, whispering to himself, "This is it. No turning back now." His reflection in the glass showed a man both terrified and resolute. Inside, the flight attendant was already seated with their attorney, posture upright, confidence radiating. Their whispers were low but laced with certainty. "This will be straightforward," the lawyer assured, sliding papers across the table. "We'll control the narrative. The jury will see professionalism, not prejudice." The passenger's lawyer leaned close, voice steady but firm. "Remember, speak your truth. Don't let their version become the only one heard." He nodded, though his palms still sweated against the handle of his briefcase. The room filled slowly. Spectators, clerks, lawyers, flipping through documents. Every shuffle of paper felt like a countdown. Eyes darted from one side of the room to the other, the confident attendant with a team, and the passenger, alone, but unbroken. A bailiff called out, "All rise!" Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone stood. The air thickened. This was the moment. The case was about to be called. The passenger's breath caught. He could hear his own heartbeat, fast and uneven, louder than the murmurs around him. Will they believe me? Will they see the truth? Across the aisle, the attendants smoothed their uniform, face composed, lips pressed into the faintest smile. To them, this was victory waiting to be sealed. And then, silence. The heavy door at the side of the room creaked open. The judge was about to enter. Everyone's eyes turned toward the bench, unaware that the greatest shock of this entire battle hadn't even revealed itself yet. The courtroom fell into silence as the heavy oak door creaked open. All eyes turned toward the bench, waiting for the figure who would decide the fate of this case. And then, it happened. The presiding judge stepped into view. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Gasps rippled through the chamber, lawyers stiffened, spectators leaned forward. The flight attendant's face drained of color as their gaze locked onto the robed figure. Because standing at the bench was not a stranger, it was him. The very passenger they had humiliated on that flight. The man they had accused. Now, wearing the black robe of authority, calm, composed, and holding the gavel. The flight attendant's mouth opened, but no words came out. Their lawyer blinked twice, stunned, before whispering, This can't be." Papers rustled nervously on the table. The judge, once the victim, let the silence hang heavy before speaking. His voice was steady, resonant, and utterly professional. "Court is now in session." The room stirred uneasily. Everyone felt the weight of the moment, the strangeness of it. But the judge's expression remained controlled, as though carved from stone. No hint of anger, no flash of triumph, only duty. Inside, however, a storm raged. As he adjusted his robe and sat firmly on the bench, memories clawed at the edges of his composure. The sting of the seatbelt buckle in economy, the shame of whispers in the cabin, the false report written against him. Yet none of it showed on his face. This was his courtroom now, and justice demanded impartiality. The bailiff called the case, voice echoing, "Case number 1/42, the state versus—" A pause, almost hesitant. "Versus the defendant." The irony hung in the air so thick it was suffocating. The flight attendant fidgeted, eyes darting to the exits as though escape were possible. Their lawyer leaned in urgently. "Stay calm. The system is on our side. Judges can recuse themselves. We'll request it." But when the motion was raised, the judge's response was deliberate. "This court recognizes the unusual circumstance. However, impartiality is not determined by past events, but by adherence to the law. I am bound by my oath. Unless there is evidence of bias beyond speculation, proceedings will continue." His tone was firm, final. The gavel tapped once, sharp and decisive. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. The flight attendant slumped slightly, realizing the request had failed. Across the room, whispers spread like wildfire. How could fate twist like this? How could the tables turn so completely? The judge leaned forward, eyes scanning the documents. We will hear arguments from both sides. Counsel, prepare your statements. Every word was measured, every gesture controlled. And yet, behind the calm exterior, a single truth pulsed in his mind. I will not let lies win. The flight attendant's attorney rose, voice quivering at first, then steady. Your Honor, my client was subjected to intimidation and disruption. They acted professionally under difficult circumstances. We will prove this beyond doubt. The judge gave a small nod. Proceed. The attendants swallowed hard, their earlier confidence shattered. The courtroom no longer felt like a safe stage. It felt like a trap of their own making. On the opposite side, the defense prepared quietly. The irony was not lost on them either. Their client was now the judge himself. But the truth had a way of demanding the spotlight, no matter how tangled the path. And so, in that room where the balance of power had shifted in a way no one could have predicted, the trial began. Outside, the city bustled unaware. But inside these four walls, history was unfolding. Justice, irony, and truth colliding in a single heartbeat. The gavel struck again, signaling the start of testimony. And as voices prepared to rise, one question echoed in every corner of the chamber. How will a man judge the very lie that once tried to destroy him, the air? And the courtroom was electric, thick with the weight of words yet to be spoken. Every eye was fixed on the witness stand, where the flight attendant adjusted their uniform and cleared their throat. This is my account, they began, voice steady, carefully rehearsed. On that flight, I was confronted with a passenger who became aggressive. He raised his voice, made me feel unsafe, and disrupted the order of the cabin. I acted only to maintain calm. The words floated through the chamber, sharp and deliberate. Each sentence painted them as a victim of hostility, a professional simply doing their job under impossible circumstances. Their lawyer nodded approvingly, urging them forward. The judge, once the passenger, now cloaked in the robe of authority, listened silently. His eyes betrayed nothing, but inside, every word scraped against memory. He remembered the sting of being labelled intimidating for simply asking a question. Still, his tone was measured as he spoke. Continue. The attendant leaned in, voice softening for effect. When I filed the report, I did so because I feared for the safety of myself and those around me. It was never personal. Murmurs stirred in the gallery. Some nodded sympathetically. Others frowned, uneasy at the performance. Then came the cross-examination. The defense attorney rose slowly, eyes locked on the witness. Papers shuffled deliberately. A pause stretched long enough to make the attendant shift in their seat. You said you acted only to maintain calm, the attorney began. Tell me, if calm was your goal, why was the passenger moved from business class to economy, rather than simply reseated nearby? The attendant hesitated. It was the only available option. Are you sure? The lawyer slid a document across the table. Passenger records show multiple seats remained open in the same cabin. Care to explain? Gasps broke out in the gallery. The attendant's face tightened. I wasn't aware at the time. The lawyer pressed harder. So you weren't aware, or you chose not to be aware? The attendant glanced nervously toward their counsel. Their earlier confidence was cracking thread by thread. The defense called witnesses next. A middle-aged woman, a fellow passenger, stepped into the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied with conviction. I was seated just across the aisle. I remember clearly. He never raised his voice. He only asked politely if he could change his seat. It was the attendant who seemed tense. And then suddenly, he was sent back to economy. The words cut like a blade. Another witness followed, a young man who had sat 2 rows behind. "I remember people whispering," he said. "Not about him being disruptive, but about how wrong it felt to move him. It didn't sit right with anyone." Each testimony chipped away at the facade. Piece by piece, the story of intimidation unraveled, revealing a different truth, a truth the judge knew all too well. Still, he remained silent, impartial, guiding the proceedings with precision. "Thank you. Next witness." But inside, every testimony echoed with the weight of lived experience. He had been there. He had felt the sting of judgment, and now he was watching it unfold under oath. The flight attendant's lawyer attempted to repair the damage, objecting, redirecting, reframing. But the tide was shifting. The gallery could feel it. The truth was no longer buried. It was clawing its way to the surface. Hours passed. Stories clashed. Voices rose and fell. The courtroom became a battlefield, not of fists, but of words, memories, and evidence. And through it all, the judge remained the axis on which the scales of justice turned. Calm, controlled, but carrying the silent weight of everything unsaid. By the time the final testimony ended, the chamber was thick with unease. The truth and the lie stood exposed, side by side, waiting for judgment to decide which would prevail. The gavel tap. At once. "This court will recess. We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments." The words echoed like thunder. As the room emptied, the flight attendant avoided every eye, shoulders hunched under the collapse of their story. The defense gathered quietly, resolute. And the judge? He remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty witness stand. Because he knew the next chapter would not simply be about words, it would be about the final reckoning. The courtroom was still, as though the very walls understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Days of testimony, cross-examinations, and whispered debates had led to this singular moment. Every seat was filled, every breath held. The air felt heavier than stone. The bailiff's voice broke the silence. "All rise." Chairs scraped back in unison. The judge entered, robe flowing, expression unreadable. He took his seat at the bench, lifted the gavel, and with a firm strike declared, "Court is now in session." The eyes of the world, or so it seemed, bore down on this one room. At the prosecution table, the flight attendant sat rigid, hands clasped tightly, knuckles white. Their lawyer whispered something meant to calm, but the words slipped past unheard. Across the aisle, the defense sat steady, the weight of truth their only shield. The judge leaned forward, scanning the chamber. His voice carried the weight of both law and lived experience. "We have heard the testimonies. We have reviewed the evidence. And today, this court delivers its verdict." A hush swept the room. Hearts raced. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. The judge began carefully, methodically. The plaintiff claimed intimidation. They claimed disorder, disruption, fear. Yet witness accounts did not support those claims. In fact, testimony after testimony painted a very different picture. A picture of dignity met with dismissal, of calm met with cruelty, of truth smothered beneath accusation. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting downward. The gavel tapped once, punctuating each word. "This court finds the plaintiff's account inconsistent with the facts. The decision to downgrade the passenger was not rooted in safety, but in prejudice. What was reported as intimidation was, in truth, humiliation." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The words cut through the air like a blade. The judge's gaze hardened, though his voice remained steady. "False accusations corrode the foundation of justice. They weaponize fear. They strip dignity. And they will not be upheld here." He paused, letting the silence draw tight around every ear in the room. "Therefore, the claims against the defendant are dismissed. This court rules in favor of the defense. For a long heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, an eruption. Some in the gallery clapped. Others whispered furiously. Some simply sat stunned. The flight attendant froze, face pale, disbelief etched into every line. Across the room, the defense attorney exhaled slowly, relief flooding through their shoulders. Justice, at long last, had pierced the fog. The judge raised a hand, calling the room back to order. His tone shifted, deeper, almost personal. This case is not just about one incident on one flight. It is about the silence that follows humiliation, about the danger of bending truth to shield oneself, and about the cost carried by those who dare to speak up. The words landed with force. People leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single syllable. "Let this verdict serve as a reminder," he continued, "that justice cannot be rewritten by lies, nor can dignity be erased by silence." The gavel struck again, firm, final. Court is adjourned. Chairs scraped. Murmurs rose, but no one left unchanged. The irony of the moment, the man once humiliated, now delivering justice, hung like a shadow over the chamber. The flight attendant was escorted out, their earlier confidence shattered, their silence now louder than their accusations. The defense team gathered their papers with quiet triumph, but their client, the judge, remained seated. Behind his calm expression, a storm lingered. He had upheld the law, spoken the truth, and restored justice. Yet he knew the deeper questions remained unanswered. Questions about a world that allowed such prejudice to flourish in the first place. As the courtroom emptied, he looked once more at the empty witness stand. The echoes of testimony still rang in his ears. And in that stillness, one thought pressed heavily. The battle for dignity did not end with this verdict. It had only begun. The verdict had been delivered. The gavel's echo still lingered, but its impact was already reaching far beyond the four walls of that courtroom. News outlets seized the story within hours. Headlines blazed across screens. Humiliated passenger turned judge delivers justice. Courtroom twist exposes hidden bias. Truth prevails in landmark case. Talk shows dissected every angle. Commentators debated professionalism, prejudice, and the razor-thin line between perception and reality. Some dismissed the case as a one-off twist of fate, but others insisted it was a mirror, reflecting a truth society often chooses not to see. Clips of witnesses recounting the flight replayed on television. Hashtags spread across social media, carrying voices that had long been muted. People shared their own stories of quiet humiliation, of being judged before being heard. The case had struck a chord far deeper than the courtroom itself. Meanwhile, in the stillness of his chambers, the judge sat alone. He removed the robe that symbolized authority and placed it gently on the chair beside him. For a moment, he simply breathed, as though exhaling the years of silence that had preceded this day. He looked out the window at the city below. Cars weaving through traffic, people moving with purpose, unaware of the storm that had just shifted the air. His reflection caught in the glass, and he whispered softly, "From silence to justice." Memories returned uninvited. The sting of being told to move. The whispers in the cabin. The label of intimidating when all he had offered was dignity. He remembered the ache of swallowing words he wanted to scream, because speaking up might only deepen the wound. And now, the world was speaking for him. In interviews, some passengers from that flight expressed relief. "We always knew it was wrong," one woman confessed, "but we didn't know what to say back then." The judge considered those words carefully. Silence was not always agreement. Sometimes silence was fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of being targeted, fear of standing alone. But silence could also be complicity, and that was the lesson echoing now. The case had become more than justice served. It had become a symbol, a warning that bias, when left unchecked, could destroy lives, and a reminder that truth, no matter how buried, eventually claws its way into the light. In the weeks that followed, institutions revisited their training programs. Airlines reviewed policies. Conversations about fairness, race, and accountability made their way into boardrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables. It was not enough to undo the harm, but it was a beginning. The judge, though, remained cautious. He knew change was fragile. He knew headlines fade, and he knew real progress required more than symbolic victories. Still, as he prepared to leave the courthouse that evening, he felt the faintest weight lift. Justice had not erased the scars of humiliation, but it had transformed them into something larger, something powerful. As he walked down the steps, reporters rushed forward with microphones, voices overlapping. "Your Honor, what lesson should the world take from this case?" He paused, looking out at the sea of expectant eyes. His words were steady, deliberate. That dignity is not negotiable. That prejudice, no matter how subtle, leaves deep wounds, and that truth, even when silenced, will always find its voice again. The cameras flashed, the crowd stirred, and the echo of his words carried further than he could have imagined. Because this was no longer just his story. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been unseen, and everyone still waiting for their truth to be heard. And as the night settled over the city, one truth remained unshaken. Dignity must never be compromised, and justice must never be denied.